Okay, so we're going to step right into our program today with our first panel. I want to emphasize to everyone, we are delivering this in a dual capacity, right? We're doing it virtually plus in person. So in order for the people who are virtual to hear us, and also so that we can record these proceedings for publication, if you have questions, please use the microphone. There's one right there. So our first panel is being moderated by Diane Francis, and she's put together an outstanding group of journalists who are going to focus in on supply chain challenges for the United States and Canada. Now, many of you were here last night, and you heard that Diane was the recipient of our Sidney Picker Award, a much deserving recipient. Diane is a well-known journalist. She's the editor-at-large of the National Post. She's been published all over the world in Post Media newspaper chain, the Atlantic Council, and interestingly, the Kiev Post. She is a very detail-oriented, researching journalist. If you've read her blogs recently or her column on what's going on in the Ukraine, she comes up with facts and insights that you just can't get anywhere. So it's an honor and privilege to have Diane moderate our first panel. Diane.
Okay, all right, I'm on. I'm not sure how this is going to work. I have three panelists, and they're all remote. And I'm going to try and do a debate with them later, but I don't know if we'll all be able to see them or they'll be split-screened or what. But anyway, we'll go. Let's go. I'm going to start giving you the scene, setting the scene for actually the whole conference, but the supply chain issues. And we're going to plunge into it from the point of view of journalists who are, in the trenches, talking to the politicians and the business people and the unions about the issues on a more granular level. But to give you the overview, we've been in an era of freer trade. We never quite achieved free trade, but freer trade. And, it began with the European Union, which was a terrific example, and then grew into NAFTA and what we have now. And more global trade, more and more members into the WTO. And all of that has created a global economy that's stitched together with supply chains that are very effective and very pervasive. Cracks began to appear when China was caught cheating on its books, the way it kept its books for its public companies listed in the United States and also in its own country, stealing intellectual property, harvesting it without acceding to legal copyright and patent laws. That's when the cracks really started to appear. And then, of course, on top of that was the upheaval in labor markets in the richer countries who hadn't adapted or didn't have workers or a system that could adapt to the fact that they were going to be offshored to death. So we have rust belts in Ontario and Ohio and in parts of Europe as well. And this, of course, created a huge backlash against so-called free trade, which, as I say, was really never that free. And now we have a situation where the pandemic came along, and that began to rattle the supply chain system through lockdowns, aggravating the ability to access, aggravating favoritism. Healthcare supplies made in China kept for the Chinese, even though they were contractually obligated to deliver them to North America and Europe. So all of these things, understandably, they were trying to protect their own people, but all of these things have undermined the old so-called free trade system and most of the supply chains. And then we have the war. The war with Russia has, I think, launched on the heels of the pandemic a de-globalization. We have a new world order. Supply chains are going to be politicized. Supply chains are going to be completely revamped, ended in some cases, replaced with better, but not necessarily better systems. And that's the way it's going to be from now on, particularly as Russia is cratered economically by the Biden administration and the alliances, which, by the way, I agree with. And they're going to be put offline. Their commodities and so on, they're the biggest. So we're also going to go through a major resource reset. And countries like the United States, Canada, Brazil, Australia, countries that are very resource rich are going to ascend in importance. And they are already being badgered by people who want to replace the old supply chains that they had and the old sourcing they had in Russia and in other countries with those countries with the rule of law, with rules-based trade and plenty of resources. So that means that Canada, Australia, the United States, Brazil, and other very rich resource countries are going to have more business, more activity, and more opportunities and more benefits. And it's not that they're benefiting off the horrors of a war, it's just that people cannot and will not be able to trust Russia as a supplier. And they're roughly 20% of the resource mix. That's not 20% of the foodstuffs, but 20% of critical metals and minerals, 20% of the oil and gas supplies, and things like potash and fertilizers. So they're very critical, and they're going to be taken offline, virtually, in my opinion. So that's going to change everything as well. That's the bigger picture. And then, grilling down, there's the specific areas. There's the energy supply lines, which are going to be dealt with in another panel. The auto industry, which is critical to the United States and Canada, Europe as well, and China. That's another panel. And then you've got the supply chain issues surrounding the transfer of technology, particularly technology that's of national security importance or industrial importance, and telecoms. So these are going to be areas where things are going to change as well in terms of the overall supply chain situation. Military goods, of course, foodstuffs, naturally. And again, I would say that China runs the risk of being also partially put offline, which is even more disruptive because of its failure to condemn the invasion, and also because of other dislikes toward the China going back to when the cracks began to appear over supply chain shenanigans, shall we say, and trade shenanigans. So the whole thing is going to be moved around and changed. There's going to be winners and losers. And I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see a world that, in terms of supply chain, is going to go from offshoring to partial onshoring. In other words, let's get our jobs back and close those factories in China and Mexico or wherever, to friend-shoring. So we're going to have friend-shoring. So we're going to deal with countries that we're compatible with geopolitically. Right or wrong, expensive or cheap, that's going to be more and more the trend. So it changes the matrix, and that is sort of my take on the bigger picture and to set the scene for the whole supply chain issues that you're going to hear today, which are critically important. So that's my piece. Now I'm going to turn, I have three terrific panelists, journalists, and I'm going to, they're introduced in the program, so I'm not going to reintroduce them except just to give you their names. And I'm going to start off, I'm going to ask each of them to give us about 7 minutes from a specific viewpoint about what they see the supply chain issues going forward are. And then I'm going to ask them some supplemental questions and hopefully get them to engage if I can figure out how to get them engaged, not seeing them, or seeing them on a split screen. And then we're going to do a Q&A with the audience, and that'll should do it. Going to open up with Todd Spangler, who is based in Washington, D.C. as a reporter covering Washington for the Detroit Free Press, a very important newspaper and a very important part of the United States. And I'm going to ask Todd to give us his 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, however long he wants to take, on the supply chain controversies, issues, solutions, whatever he wants to talk about from an American perspective. Todd?
Hi, can everybody hear me? It's hard for me to tell.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Diane, thank you for having me on this panel. It's really an honor. And hello to Governor Blanchard, who I know well. I do have to say before I start that it's also a real honor to be on here with Alex and with David. David may not remember this, but 20 years ago, when I was running the Associated Press Bureau in Pittsburgh, he and I had breakfast when he was coming into the Post-Gazette. It's really a pleasure to see him again. I don't know that I have 5 or 7 minutes really to talk to add here, but I will say that from my perspective, the supply chain issues, which certainly the auto companies, which I pay specific attention to, are trying to work out these questions, particularly about semiconductors and battery materials and items like that. But that the disruptions are such that there's really no good answer as to what's going to happen going forward, in large measure because of the war in Ukraine, and also because this question of whether or not there is going to be a recession. I mean, when you have a Larry Summers saying that there's a 50 to 75% chance of a recession in the next 2 years, automakers may be moving to redo supply chains, but that could be completely tossed out the window if there's a major recession. Recessions have a very strong impact on a state like Michigan, on the manufacturing that happens in that state and in the Midwest. If that happens, I can see those supply chains being tossed all over again. There's just so much questions out there about how to remake these supply chains. Like Diane said, the China question is a big one. If something happens with Taiwan, what happens with semiconductors? I know there's an enormous effort underway to try to get semiconductor manufacturing, which is so important to automakers, into the U.S. But again, if there is a recession, some of that capital could dry up. Some of those plans could really get tossed aside. And so it's really moving through a truly uncertain time that it's difficult to see where it's gonna end. I will say the other thing that comes to mind on this question is the question of friend shoring or ally shoring, and which is how it's talked about by some folks here in D.C. There is, politically speaking, there has been these very strange indications, even between allies such as the U.S. and Canada, where during the trucker blockade of the Ambassador Bridge that lasted a week and cost manufacturers, millions of dollars, we had Democrats in the Michigan delegation, at least one that I can think of, saying, here's another example of why we need domestic production, meaning the U.S. And I mean, it's just the sort of thing that, having covered this relationship for more than a decade, it's very strange to hear Michigan politicians talking about Canada in that kind of way. I mean, that there's just, the relationship goes back so far that when you start talking in that politically speaking, when we start talking about, even with the U.S. content stuff in Build Back Better, when they talk about it needs to be U.S. content for electric vehicles, and something that Trudeau talked to Biden about and is clearly not happy about, which might even violate the USMCA. Politically speaking, this is a really fraught time for that relationship and how to figure out those supply chains. So I'll leave it at that. But it's a really unsettled time, and it's going to be a fascinating time going forward.
Aside, as we go through all of this disruption, and could you tell me whether this has legs politically and may end up not shattering, but shall we say corroding the U.S.-Canada relationship in all respects?
I think it has legs politically, which is the problem with it. I think that there's enough policy and enough people who behind the scenes are saying this is not going to work, that I don't know whether it will actually change the relationship. I just think we're going through a period where, politically speaking, it makes sense for a lot of people to talk about this for campaigns and to try to make points. By the way, I should also throw out, it's my sense that there's a lot of that going on with Line 5. We mentioned Line 5 earlier. I mean, there seems to be a lot of sort of political posturing about Line 5 that just doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense not to sit down at a table and work out these issues versus the rhetoric that you hear, and a lot of it coming from Michigan. So it's political rhetoric has a chance of becoming political reality, and I think right now the protectionism that you hear is getting pushed back enough by people like Manchin, Joe Manchin, mostly because Toyota is doing business in his state, that may not be part of this. For instance, in Build Back Better, but I think that it is a really, really unsettled time, and I think Ambassador Cohen's got his work cut out for him. Of course, a guy who did what he did with Randell in Philadelphia is probably up to the task. So there you go.
Conversation with you and the other two. Our next journalist is Alex Panetta, who's also based in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Hi, Alex.
Hi.
Hi. I want you to address, and there'll be overlap, so change lanes, no problem, that's okay, because I'm sure many of the Canadian concerns about supply chain issues are something that was just addressed by Todd in terms of our auto industry and Buy America and all that sort of thing. So could you address the supply chain issues going forward from the Canadian viewpoint?
Sure. So I'll just throw out a scenario that I don't think most Canadians would have imagined they'd find themselves in a few years ago. And that's that we may find that we arrive at a moment where Canadians are grateful that Donald Trump forced us to renegotiate NAFTA. And which would have been inconceivable a few years ago because we were dragged in kicking and screaming and resolutely unenthusiastic about it. But I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday here in Washington who was talking about the inefficiencies of our trading relationship and saying the USMCA is an imperfect deal. It's if you had to design a trade deal from scratch, this is not the one you would end up with. And I said, well, we don't live in that perfect world. We live in the world we live in, and there had been a disconnect for years between elite opinion on trade and popular opinion on trade. Even in Canada, where free trade is generally popular, you see it was not as popular as elite opinion would have led you to believe. And I'm basing that on public opinion polling and what you'd hear when you talk to people not involved in public policy. Suddenly, you've got this trade agreement that it has bipartisan consensus behind it in the United States. It's not going to be blown up anytime soon. It would be shocking if it were. And not just that, it could actually act as a bulwark against future problems. And I'll give you an example. Canadians followed this electric vehicle tax credit debate a little bit over the last few months when it seemed that Canadians might be potentially frozen out to a certain extent out of this, or Canadian production will be shut out of this electric vehicle credit. A huge concern to our country. So much has changed in a few months. The credit appears dormant, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But one of the things that USMCA might allow us to do is if and when that credit ever resurfaces as an issue in Congress, and I'm not sure it will, but if it does, there are amendments ready to go within Congress to switch the credit designed by Debbie Stabenow and others to replace it with the USMCA standard, saying basically if the vehicle qualifies under USMCA's rules of origin, that's good enough, it's eligible for the credit. Again, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm not saying it's going to arrive on the floor, but if it does, there's a decent chance that that thing gets 51, 52 votes, and suddenly Canadians are grateful that USMCA exists. And that's just an example of how, the phenomenon I think Diane referred to as friendshoring, how it, could occasionally act in Canada's favor, not always. But that's one example of how it manifests itself. Speaking of EVs, I just wanted to sort of touch on the latest there. I think most people here are probably aware of Build Back Better being stalled. Joe Manchin kind of pulled the plug on it for now. It may come back in some lesser, more limited form. If it does, what I'm detecting is not a lot of expectation that the electric vehicle credit, the irritant, in the form it had originally appeared, would resurface. Even, Debbie Stabenow, whom I referred to earlier, senator from Michigan, was asked, I think, on a panel a few weeks ago, if it were to come back, what would you like to see? And she said, would we just be happy to have the existing electric vehicle credit extended? So, I mean, when the provision sponsors are not even expressing much hope of it surviving in the previous form, I don't think you'd expect it to come back. And if it does come back, as I said earlier, there are amendments ready to go within the Senate, so you'd probably end up with something more palatable from a Canadian perspective. So electric vehicles brings us closely connected to the issue of critical minerals. President Biden recently invoked the Defense Production Act on that. I think, it's funny, the critical minerals story in Canada is really a play in three acts. Act one is, what are critical minerals? I've never heard of these things. And that's just a few years ago. And then you arrived in a place over the last couple of years where Canadians were kind of being told or hearing that we might be some critical mineral superpower, to the point that it might be a source of political leverage for us. And I think that might have been overstated a little bit. I think just a few months ago, you had a union leader in Canada saying, well, if we suffer from these electric vehicle credits, we're not going to send our minerals to the U.S. I said, well, that was a kind of a preemptive use of a geopolitical weapon you don't even own. Yes, these minerals sit in Canadian soil. They're hard to get. They're not always economically viable. And it's going to take some hard work to develop that sector. And I think we're in the third stage, or the third act of this play, and which is a recognition of the challenge ahead. And I think you're seeing that addressed in a bunch of places, including in the recent federal budget in Canada, which earmarked, I'm going from memory here, I think it was $8 billion over a few years, or maybe $3 billion over 8 years. Several $billion over a few years for things like mapping, infrastructure, and investments in certain projects. So, because, like I said, all these things are not commercially viable at this point. But if you're talking about a geopolitical protection against China's dominance over this space and not wanting to find yourself threatened, with being cut off or threatened with shortages like in semiconductors, that recent federal budget at least acknowledges the challenge and takes a step toward alleviating it. I think we're going to have a little bit of clarity in the next bit on what this friendshoring looks like. I think a lot of people here are probably familiar with this semiconductor bill, or this CHIPS Act, or I think it's Competes Act. It was what it was called in the House of Representatives. Basically, a bunch of funding for semiconductor production in the United States, a big industrial policy bill. An aspect of that bill is of great interest to Canada. There's a page in there, a couple pages in there referring to Canada. And sorry, before I get into that, I'll just say that the state of the bill is it's passed both houses of Congress. It's passed the House and Senate in different forms, and it's going to probably go to conference committee soon. And I expect it will probably pass Congress within a few months. In that bill, there's a long reference to Canada. And some other trading partners, but I'll talk about the Canadian portion for a sec. It requires the U.S. administration to publish within 90 days a strategy for how it intends to work with Canada on issues related to China. Where do the United States and Canada agree on working with China? Where does it disagree with Canada on China policy? Where are the vulnerabilities in the supply chain? What are the opportunities? It's fantastic because basically Canadians will get to see this blueprint published, and I think it's supposed to be mostly unclassified. There will be a classified portion to it as well, so that's something to look out for, and that'll give us a sense of what this friendshoring may look like. But of course, you can lay out these strategies. I think Ambassador Cohen mentioned earlier that strategies are great and everything, but they have vulnerabilities too, and they can be susceptible to events. Just think back 4 years ago. Canada was talking about sectoral trade agreements with China, and was having a really difficult time renegotiating USMCA or NAFTA with the US, and was looking toward China for a possible new trade deal, partly to maybe, poke a stick in the eye at the Trump administration. And then suddenly Meng Wanzhou was arrested. Canadians have been imprisoned by the Chinese, and that kind of scrambled the entire picture. Again, think just a few months ago how electric vehicles were going to turn into this monumental irritant between Canada and the United States. And more recently, just a few weeks ago, the Ambassador Bridge, which Todd referred to. I mean, I think some people were kind of spooked by that, saying, well, if we want a friendshore, will our friends' goods be available easily to us? So, these unforeseen events can scramble this strategy. But at the end of the day, other events bring us together. And I think Ukraine, the last few weeks, my understanding is most conversations between Canada and the United States in Washington, just Ukraine is the issue now, and some of the other stuff has taken a back seat. And you look at American public opinion polling on Ukraine, it's not all that different from Canada's. I think, if I'm not mistaken, something like 80% of Americans see Russia as a foe, side with Ukraine in this conflict. And 2/3 or more of Americans are willing to sanction Russia, even if it worsens inflation in the United States. So then you get into these questions of fundamental values where our national interests intersect and that bolster our friendship. So that's where things stand from what I can see. Like I said, just keep an eye on this Competes Act conference committee. I think it'll be interesting to see how the United States sees the competition with China and Canada's place in it.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So to sum it up, same old relationship, bickering at the edges, but no fundamental confrontations and problems. That's a good thing for both of us. The next speaker is Professor David Shribman. He's at McGill's School of Public Policy, the Max Bell School of Public Policy. And welcome, and I'd like you to address the issues involving international supply chains.
Well, thank you. And I would say that Alex and Ton are far more informed and far more articulate on this subject than am I. I'll give you an anecdote to start. When my daughter, who was an orchestra manager, she's now the chief of staff of the San Francisco Symphony, went to Stanford Business School, and in her first semester, she was required to take a course in supply chain management. And I thought that was some kind of a joke, that somebody who would be involved in labor negotiations with violinists and in trying to keep an orchestra hall open even before co-ed should have had to have taken that. And she said, "Oh no, Dad, that's a serious topic." I would also say, to give some broader perspective on all of this, that in the decade and a half in which I was in Washington, in the Washington bureaus of the two most important papers in national papers in the country, the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, there was only one person who cared about the U.S.-Canada relationship of the 100 people in those two bureaus, and that was me. And everybody kind of laughed me off the stage when it was clear to me that the best way to empty a room in Washington was to utter the three words, softwood lumber dispute. So the notion that this is front of mind in our minds, I'm a Canadian and American, and in the minds of the people here, it's true, but it's not necessarily front of mind in Washington, particularly with COVID raging and with the war in Ukraine raging. But I would say this, that disputes about trade have traditionally, with some important exceptions, traditionally been second-tier disputes in political Washington. They have enormous economic impact, to be sure. And companies and lobbyists fight furiously over them. But the general Washington attitude toward these is that they're peripheral. That's not always the case, though, and it may well not be the case now. In 1828, that was the first tariff dispute I covered in 1828. The so-called Tariff of Abominations set South Carolina against pretty much the rest of the North and was a precursor to the American Civil War. It was a huge dispute, basically, between and among agricultural interests and manufacturing interests, even though manufacturing interests at the time were quite small. Even more recently, in 1984 and 1988, the presidential elections, particularly in Iowa, came down to questions about free trade. The free trade coalition and the free trade notion in the United States was very, very strong from 1945 and 1946 all the way to about 1987, when the focus really was on Japan. And Dick Gephardt, congressman from Missouri, won the Iowa caucuses in 1988 by virtue of his talk about protectionism. So the great danger in all of this supply chain management issue is the threat of renewed protectionism in the United States. We saw a lot of it in the Trump years. We see traces of it, more than traces of it in the Biden rhetoric. And I would urge you to focus on when the president talks about Buy American. He can sneeze Buy American, and Canada will catch cold for good reasons. It's hard for me being in Pittsburgh, which is of course, a manufacturing center, or was, to gauge the Washington attitude toward that. But it's surely the notion that President Trump did not invent, but mobilized and utilized to protect American jobs has been a hardy perennial in American politics for the last 25 years. And to the extent to which this new crisis poses new challenges, the great danger, as both Todd and Alex have explained, is to what extent Canada is affected by this. I mean, Chrystia Freeland was astonished when President Trump regarded America's relationship with Canada as a matter of national security. It is, to be sure, a matter of national security on the northern part of the border, but not on the southern part of the border. It was an extremely unfortunate phrase, and Krista she had a good time with it. Not particularly a pleasant one, but a very effective one. So my warning here is that is the same as that of Todd, is that I worry that there are precursors to a new burst of protectionism, and that will endanger supply chain management and the entire nature of the relationship. I know a lot of business people in Canada who were apoplectic about the situation during COVID, and I worry that that could be something that we might see again. So I would defer to my other colleagues, Alex and Todd, for their expertise. And I just wanted to give you an overall sense of the salience of these issues in Washington, which is low, but the importance of them, which is high.
What is the role of the union movement in the two countries? Obviously, it's been very eroded because of so-called free trade, but what currency do they have politically and sociologically?
Well, it's very shrewd of you to divide it into political and social. You know, social and culturally, the union movements have been enormously important in American politics, really dating to what you might think of as an agricultural union that produced the Populist Party in 1892. The Roosevelt Coalition was built on the metaphorically and really on the bricks and foundation of the union movement. But today, only 13% or something like that of American workers are unionized. Even Democrats from time to time look askance at this. You know, the Democrats were the party of the unions, and in recently as 1984, presidential candidates who were trying to challenge frontrunners would always call them the tools of the labor barons. You hear that phrase all the time. Walter Mondale was particularly vulnerable to that. There aren't any or many labor barons today, and of course most labor unions today are in the service and governmental sectors. But politically, they're very, very important. The Democrats were the party of organized labor and of the working person, the working man, as we said in an earlier time, but the working person today. And now it is the Republican Party that is the leading edge of that. We've seen a dramatic switch in the profiles of the two parties. There was a time when, for example, the professors at elite American universities were all Republicans. We used to say, in my own college, I went to Dartmouth College, which is the most Canadian of the American colleges, that the way to get tenure in the English department at Dartmouth was to have a good backhand. Today, the American professors are on the left rather than on the right, and that's not an isolated thing. The union leadership may be on the side of the Democrats, but union membership increasingly, beginning with Ronald Reagan, but turbocharged during the Trump years, union members have moved in attitude, if not necessarily in voting, but largely in voting, to the Republican Party, while the kind of people who were in the Republican Party, manufacturing executives, bankers, people who were presidents of the local Rotary Club in smaller cities, though not smaller towns, became members of the Democratic Party. So we've really had, this is a case where all the isms have become wasms. And so the profile of the union movement and its place in American life is, as you so eloquently put it, a question of both culture and politics.
Just to return before I open it up to the three of you, and I want to get you to comment. I think the national security issue is exceedingly important between the two countries. And recently we saw in the fall the Department of National Defense sort of, I don't want to say shoved down Canada's throat, a deal whereby they're completely in control of vigilance in the Arctic. And then Britain came along and said that they would patrol the Arctic with their nuclear submarines. And I don't know whether we took them up on that, but they made some not very nice remarks about Canada's military unpreparedness. You want to comment on that? Because I think that's going to heat up.
If I could just jump in right there, Diane, for just a second. Christopher Freeland, quite rightly ridiculed the notion of national security in this relationship, because since 1989, there was no question about American national security anywhere in the world. Ukraine's changed all of that. Questions of national security are salient now. And so just that phrase now is freighted with meaning that didn't have before February 23rd or 24th. So national security now involves access to resources and worries about nuclear annihilation in a way that they didn't if we had held this conference in January. We would have used those phrases with a little more cavalier approach, I think.
Excellent. All right, I'm just going to throw out a question. I'd like each of you, let's start with Todd and then Alex, and then David can weigh in on the issue of what do you think in the next, what is your fearless forecast as to the next supply chain controversies, the next one or two in the next year, anywhere in the world? What's going to be a flashpoint?
Well, I know from my point of view, I'm very Michigan oriented. So I'm just thinking about cars. I'm thinking about, what happens next in terms of fixing supply chains. And to be honest with you, and David touched on this with his daughter's example. Previous to the pandemic, there's 800 top tier suppliers to the auto industry. There's 18,000 suppliers beneath that, and no one knew who they were. I mean, the auto companies did not have people who knew who the bottom suppliers were. They do now. I mean, so they've figured that out, but now they're trying to search around and say, and GM's trying to get stuff out of Australia, and others are. I mean, Chrysler's doing stuff in Ontario. They're all trying to figure that out. The question is going to be whether or not the attack on globalism, because you have Larry Fink at BlackRock saying globalism's dead. I mean, you have people at saying that these supply links are not going to get put back into place. And I think a big question for me is if the auto companies are going to try to start selling more electric vehicles, and these new supply chains cost more at a time when inflation is rising and threatening a recession, how do those factors all come together and they actually sell the damn cars? Because if they don't, then it doesn't matter if they say they're going to invest, and they're going to have to do something else. So I'm really sort of watching all of that and how the Competes Act and how that just all plays together. It's just, like I said, I just don't know exactly where, if Taiwan's still making semiconductors and making them less expensively than Intel is in Columbus. I don't know what that. That supply chain might just move back over there if it's more effective. I just see tremendous uncertainty, and I'm like you. I'm watching this friendshoring versus whether there's just a shrug and say, well, we're not done with globalism yet. So that's sort of how I'm watching it play out.
Alex? Is Alex there?
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
In the
flash points next year.
In the short term, energy, Todd referred earlier to Line 5. At some point, the Michigan government or the United States and Canada are talking about a longer term solution to that issue. Somebody's going to have to make a decision soon about whether that pipeline gets refurbished under the Great Lakes. That's going to be a short term issue. Longer term, critical minerals. And I don't know whether this surfaces over the next year, but it could. President Biden just invoked the Defense Production Act. At the same time as his party was on the verge of introducing a tax credit that would have discriminated against inputs of critical minerals from Canada. Now, the potential disconnect there is Canada's part of the U.S. defense industrial base. So if we're part of your national defense industrial base, but at the same time, and you're also calling critical minerals part of that of your national security strategy, but at the same time threatening tariffs on some of the products created in a country that is part of your defense industrial base. There's a disconnect there that has to sort of be worked out. And I think we're going to have to figure out a long-term plan on how we guarantee that we have access to these inputs that are going to be monumentally important in shifting to electric vehicles.
David, in particular, your worry about protectionism. Does that apply to both sides of the border, or what flashpoint?
I was for 16 years the editor of a newspaper, and we used to say that news is what the editor sees on his way to work. Well, right now, no one's going to work or in the office, and so I would say that the two biggest challenges I would see are the two biggest things that a household has to do in the course of their economic lives. And actually they apply to my own life as well. And that is home and car. Those are the two biggest purchases any American or Canadian makes. In terms of car, we all know that car prices are skyrocketing. You can't buy a used car. You can't buy a new car. I think that's a huge problem. And home repairs and home construction. We're doing a construction project at home, kind of a renovation deal, and every week the prices of the implements and the materials go up. And I think Americans who have spent more time in their homes and who have looked around and say, well, this needs fixed, and needs to be fixed, and this needs to be repaired, are going to feel this, and it's going to have a political impact in a greater way than the toy crisis we thought we'd have last Christmas. So I would say the two biggest investments a family makes are the two biggest flashpoints, and that would be automobiles and homes.
Okay. Okay, now, the audience. We have time for questions. I think we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So I don't know is everyone's mic on, if the green light's on, or do you have to push it? So just raise your hand and ask me the question, and I'll let my panelists jump in, or I'll sort of direct who might best answer this. When you're lawyers, you have to cross-examine here. Let's go. We're ready for the cross. Larry?
I'd like to hear what the panelists have to say about the prospects of the U.S. midterms and what that might do not only to the relationship in general, but to the supply chain issue. Will the ground be changed substantially when it comes to Canada-U.S. issues on supply chains, critical minerals, and that sort of thing? Or will life kind of go on with perhaps a bit more tensions, but go on as it has up till now? So I'm interested in what might happen as a result of the midterms, and we all know what the predictions seem to be.
Excellent question. Okay, let's, Todd, would you like to start? Todd, then Alex, then David again, in that order?
Sure, yeah. I expect that there's a better than decent chance that the Republicans retake the House and take the Senate, although not by large margins. I think the impact on that going forward depends on a whole bunch of different things. Clearly, that Republican Congress will set itself up against President Biden. The question will end up being how much does that Congress bring Trumpism with it? Because Trumpism was protectionist to a great degree. I mean, again, the idea that Canada was a national security risk was broke norms in a way that if that new Congress sees that as the way forward, and that they need to boost their chances with union members in Michigan and Ohio, then you'll see more of that protectionism. It'll become more of a part of that. That Congress will also almost certainly not want to give money or spend money. It's going to argue that Biden's overspent money and increased inflation, and they're going to have to take every time the price goes up, they're going to use it against him and say it's not their fault, it's his. And so they're not going to be spending money to try to help shore up supply chains, I don't think, in any great capacity. So those are my initial thoughts. It won't resolve any uncertainties, certainly.
Just your take on it. My take on Joe Biden is that this is a man with a very pronounced moral compass, but he's also a deal maker, and he believes in democracy. And I would think that a change in the midterms, he will turn more moderate just to get things done. What do you think?
I agree, and I think he has done that too. I think he's trying to play both the long game of I want to keep the progressive wing, which has so much energy in it, close to me by Build Back Better and other things. But at the same time, when it comes to actually getting something done, he was the one working with Senator Collins and Romney and et cetera, getting the infrastructure bill done, which is still, I would argue, probably the major bipartisan achievement of his administration. And I think Build Back Better, or whatever it ends up being, will be a scaled down version, and it may bring along some Republican votes as well if it's crafted the right way. I agree with you there. I think he'll try to find ways to work with that, work with the Republican Congress. The question will be whether or not the Senate's willing to go along with him in an election year.
Good luck. He'll break through.
Yeah, he'll break through on some things. I think he'll have his share of headaches too.
Okay, Alex?
I'd anticipate you'd probably see a few pieces of legislation. I mean, it won't be a remarkable, it would not be a productive Congress, but some things would get done, I think, at some point, because both party have an interest in at least being able to say, look, this is what we've achieved. The question is, and the risk to Canada is does protectionism become the glue that unites President Biden and a Republican Congress? I mean, would you see a bunch of Buy American proposals get through in whatever legislation ends up getting cooked up over the coming 2 years? It's definitely a possibility. Some irritants will go away. I don't think you'll have this electric vehicle irritant resurfacing, as I said earlier. You'd see a Congress that's friendlier to Canadian oil. But there are limits to the usefulness of that if you're in the Canadian oil sector. So, for example, under President Obama, the Congress even passed a bill to get the Keystone Pipeline built, and he kind of just ignored it. So, I don't think there's a major change there. Todd referred to the macroeconomic effects, and I think one thing that we want to start looking at is the debt ceiling. The way 25, 30 years ago, it would have been, if not inconceivable, certainly a remote possibility. That we'd be living in a world where it might become impossible for a U.S. president to get a Supreme Court justice named unless he controls Congress. We may be entering a world where debt ceilings become harder and harder to extend unless a presidential party controls Congress. And who knows what bedlam that could cause for the global economy. You'd like to believe that they'd be able to extend it. I think they probably will. But the level of drama we witnessed over the last decade on this issue is just continuing to escalate. And I think it could get worse and worse until pandemonium gets unleashed. And that's something to keep an eye on.
David?
Diane, if you were to choose the profession, that would be from horticulturalists to barbers, who would be the least well qualified to make predictions about American politics. I think you would have chosen journalists. My wife often says, only half in jest, that her husband, I thought Gary Hart would be a two-term president. So to ask us to make is a very, very risky thing. But I'll go against the grain here. I think that the Democrats will lose control in a pretty severe way, with a pretty large number, almost approaching the Obama and Clinton numbers of 1994 and 2010, but that the Democrats will enhance their position in the Senate from 50-50 plus Westmount High School's sweetheart of Westmount High School, Kamala Harris, to 51-49. And so I think that's a recipe for paralysis. I think Alex's analysis about the dangers and opportunities in there is spot on, but I think you're going to have a split Congress. You're going to have a president that is peculiarly unable to articulate a vision. Take a look at the column in the Wall Street Journal that'll appear in print tomorrow, that's online today, by Peggy Noonan, about the kind of rhetoric that the president uses and how ineffectual it is. And I think we're looking towards unusually ineffective Congress. That may seem redundant to Canadian ears, but I think unusually unproductive.
I'm going to add on to what you said, David, about how we are eminently unqualified as journalists to answer a lot of different questions. So now I'm going to go to...
Hang on. After something happens that we didn't predict, we will be able to analyze why it happened and say we saw it coming all the way.
Exactly, because we have the last word. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, none of you are business people or economists, but you're reporting. I'm asking you to be reporters here. What are you hearing from sources, economic, business, and otherwise, as to whether or not we're going to have a recession this year?
Well, I'll go first. Having I took one economics course and got a B- in it, and having predicted 9 of the last 4 recessions, I think that a recession is almost inevitable. Equity prices are too high. The economy still doesn't have enough workers. Inflation is raging. I don't see anything good about this, and it can't. And as Charlie Schultz once said that something, a great economist, Carnegie Mellon, down the street from where I live, something that can't go on forever, can't go on forever.
Alex, what are you hearing?
Yeah, so the big bank economists are looking at a 1/3 to a 50% chance of a recession in the next year or two. It's like, I mean, it's the ultimate economist answer. You got a 50% chance of something happening. So yeah, there's obviously a good chance of a recession in the next couple of years. The question is, what do supply chain changes over the last few years do to a recession? The IMF had an interesting paper this week. The World Bank IMF financial meetings are happening in Washington right now. And its global economic outlook looked at some of the issues we've talked about this morning, and it describes a scenario where there is a shortage of industrial inputs, and looks at this shortage causing a recession or decline, a GDP decline of 0.8%. 0.4%. Sorry, I'm taking that. 0.8%. But it says diversified supply chains would reduce the damage of such a recession by half. So you'd start, something that would cause a GDP reduction of 0.8 would suddenly be only 0.4 because we have diversified our chain of industrial inputs, and that's kind of the risk of protectionism, is you make a recession worse.
About a recession overall and sort of the autos and the auto sector.
Well,
Is there going to be a recession there?
For everything. There's in autos, it's a very complicated sort of thing, because people are willing to spend more on cars because they need them right now, but they can't get them. As production ramps up, if the supply chain settles itself, then there's demand. They'll be able to sell cars, but at some point, like, that'll hit. People are just already starting to say, you know what, screw it, I'm not going to buy a car right now. I'll hold off until they come down, and they might not come down anytime soon. So that could have a sort of rolling effect to push inflation up. I will say that Alex is right about the things you could do, supply chain diversification, and there's a bunch of, if no one's going to do this, but there's an argument to be made that if you allow more migrants into the country, it could bring down, if you get rid of tariffs that the Trump administration put into place, that the Biden administration has been very slow to walk back, it could have an impact, some great impacts on inflation, and of a point or so. But whether that's going to happen, there's just such political problems with doing that. It seems like very smart people expect a recession to happen, and I take them at their word that that's likely to occur. How big that is, how long it lasts, how aggressive the Fed is going to be in the politically charged world we live in is really a big question about that. And right now they haven't been very aggressive. They say they're going to be, but it's tough to see that happening until there's a lot of pain on the street. And so yeah, I think it's coming, and how it gets worked out, it might be it doesn't look like right now it's necessarily going to have to be as bad as the Great Recession was, but there's probably going to have to be some pretty strong action taken to keep that from happening. And I just wanted to jump back real quick to the midterm question too. There is also a question about if the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade, what sort of impact does that have on the election as well? And that's up in the air.
Okay, one more question.
We have an online question, and it says, you had briefly mentioned the trucker protests in Canada, and of course, trucks are key to the supply chain. What are your perspectives on how that has evolved, including government reaction and response, as well as the truckers and the business community? Also, what about response in the U.S. and impact on partnership?
Great question. Okay, let's start with David this time. So what's the fallout effect?
I'm going to defer to the experts on this. I don't really know. Most of us on this side of the border view that with astonishment, and the significance in this part of the border wasn't so much economic, though to be sure economic factors were involved. It was cultural. It was those nice Canadians up there, who care about hockey and maple syrup and go to sugar shacks in Quebec, that they should be behaving so in such an unseemly way, and that was the impact down here. It was an astonishing, and of course, as the only Canadian any of my friends ever knew, I was besieged by questions about why the Canadians who don't cross the street until the sign says you can were behaving so unruly. And I think that was the principal reaction down here, culturally. Economically, I'm going to defer to my two colleagues, but I think that it's not insignificant, the cultural disconnect that produced. I had written a piece for the Literary Review of Canada on something involving the United States, and my last line was, well, I always have a way out of this mess. I have a Canadian passport, and the most radical Canadian lover I know in Ottawa wrote me a note and said, maybe that passport's not so great anymore. So there you go.
Okay. Alex?
It couldn't have come at a worse time. Todd referred to a Michigan lawmaker using it to illustrate the need to reshore auto production. It was actually, I think, two Michigan representatives talked about it. And I made note in a story that one was Debbie Dingell, whose husband, John, was one of the co-sponsors of a bill banning U.S. oil exports in the 1970s because of the oil embargo. And I remember, and the point I made, I think, in a story was the United States can have long memories about having its industrial inputs shut off. And because that oil export embargo lasted, 4 decades. The good news for Canada is I think it's kind of come through it because for a couple of reasons. Number one, the big conversation in the U.S. about kind of cutting off Canada from this electric vehicle credit seems to have dissipated. On top of that, you've had major auto industry investments in the electric vehicle sector in Canada, battery production, cars. So the timing of that bridge closure was brutal, but it doesn't have the damage it could have had. And now you've just had this bill pass the Ontario legislature, Bill 100, which makes it the point of the bill is to make it easier for police to crack down on such a bridge closure, a vital infrastructure closure in the future. That just received royal assent, I think, last week. And now you're actually seeing similar problems on the southern border, where the Texas governor is inspecting a bunch of trucks as part of a protest against migration, and that slowed down a trade on the southern border too. So what happened in Canada has more recently happened in Texas. So no country's immune to it.
Todd?
Yeah, the protest, which I covered, the trucker protest, which I covered from here, was pretty amazing to me in terms of like David talked about the norm bursting, but then Trump really accelerated that whole idea of norms being broken, and it's been coming down. Actually, maybe before that, I mean, Brexit was a great example of that as well. I mean, it just seems like everything we took for granted got tossed out the window. I'll come back to that in a second, but I will say on the question of the trucking industry, which seems like that was part of the question as well, that here a few years ago in Washington, the question was, are we going to have autonomous trucks that won't have drivers, and what's that going to mean to the Teamsters and union driver and people like that? And that's gone away now. We're not talking about that anymore, or at least that's not front and center. What we're talking about is, wow, these truckers don't make any money, and the deregulation has left so many people, I mean, vulnerable. And then the pandemic comes and people say, I can get a job somewhere else, and screw it, I'm not going to do this anymore. There clearly needs to be more thought given to how to make the trucking industry more attractive and to reward these drivers, because they're such an important part of the supply chain. But on the other side of that is that you see even though, and we were talking about this earlier, in terms of changing supply chains, things might cost more. There have been polls done that say people want to buy American, for instance. But a Morning Consult put out something earlier this week, or last week, that said people absolutely think domestic made stuff. We want to do that. We want to buy that stuff. Oh, how much are you willing to pay for it? Well, not a lot more. And so that ends up being the question of cheap trucking was able to move stuff around, and the truckers were getting hurt by that, but it kept prices low. So I mean, I think that all those things have to be worked out together. But yeah, I think in terms of just the norm busting and where this parochialism, this protectionism leads to, is going to be extraordinary to see how it plays out. And I don't know exactly where it is going, and we'll see.
We have one more question. Time for one more. Go again. Great. Another online one? Another online one. Good.
What is the impact of 3D printing on the supply chain?
On
the supply chain.
What is the impact of,
3D printing.
3D printing, okay? Who wants to take that one? I'll take.
I have I don't know anything about 3D.
Okay, I'll take that one. As a denizen of Silicon Valley and a big tech investor, the 3D printing can eliminate the need for logistical supply chains. And as it gets more and more proficient, they're now printing pretty big houses, 3-room houses in China, and this on site. And so you will start to disintermediate the logistical supply chain altogether wherever this is doable. And so this could include, fashion, being able to make your own garments at home in a closet. This could be making kitchen cupboard gadgets and that sort of thing. So exponentially, it completely disintermediates supply chains at the end. Anybody else want to weigh in on it?
I don't know the first thing about 3D printing, but I would say that in a world that like the one you just described, countries with lots of raw materials and highly educated workforce would potentially come out better than most. So it might not be the worst thing for Canada.
David, you want to comment?
Disintermediation is where I get off the bus. I have no idea.
Yeah, it'll do to supply chains what Amazon is doing to the retail sector. Think of it that way. Okay, I think that's a wrap.
Vaccine for disinformation? Is there a vaccine for that? And how many times do you have to get it? Boosters?
Okay, well, I think this has been a great panel. I think you guys have done a great job, so let's give them a lot of applause here. We're ending a little bit early, so a little more time for bathroom break, cell phone breaks, and a coffee. Thank you.